Pipelines, big straws that crisscross the continent feeding delicious hydrocarbons to hungry refineries that squirt out awesome chemicals. In this case, lube. Pipelines are big business. In 2023, Canadian crude oil exports totaled $139 billion, and 97% of that went straight to the US of America. That's why our patriotic petroleum industry has tried expanding this pipeline network to sell more oil and gas overseas. But protests, delays, and cost overruns have caused many of these projects to be canceled or abandoned, like that screenplay on your desktop. Then our neighbors to the south woke up from a COVID fever dream and said to themselves, hey, what if we gave the nuclear codes to history's oldest demented boy king again? And like a video game boss battle, Trump's health bar reset for round 2. Now he's really tearing shit up down south while never shutting up about making Canada the 51st state. Then suddenly, 80% of the country was like, elbows up, build more pipelines, death to America. Okay, maybe not that last one. Then Canada elected net zero climate cult WEF bug-eating banker daddy PM Mark Carney, and he's promising more pipelines.
Today I'm announcing a comprehensive new approach to make Canada the world's leading energy superpower. It's time to build big time.
All I do is win, 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 no matter what. Got money on my...
But building pipelines is super hard, and it might just make the problem we're trying to solve, US control over our national destiny, way worse. So, should Canada build more pipelines? Hi, I'm Aaron Hagee McKay, and welcome to the Goose. Canada has the largest proven oil reserves in the world behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, about 170 billion barrels of oil, most of it in Alberta. That's why
Canada is a major oil and gas producing country.
While there is some conventional oil, the kind you see in old movies to imply sexy times, most of Canada's oil is bitumen, trapped in sand. And despite sounding like a slur Andrew Tate might use, bitumen is actually a low-quality, heavy crude filled with impurities, making it expensive to refine. Workers mine the sand, blast it with hot water, and then spin cycle it to remove its money juice. Unfortunately, this process also creates a whole bunch of heat-trapping air pollution and toxic sludge that piles up in tailings ponds. But frankly, that's a small price to pay to show Mother Nature we're the boss and not some beta-cuck bitumens. Starting in the 1950s, energy companies built out a giant web of pipelines that flow mostly to the United States. Even the big east-west pipelines like the Enbridge mainline cross into the US, meaning the US kind of has us over a barrel. oh, wow, we're
We have become very dependent on the US as our primary export market for our oil and our heavy oil in particular. This has not been, by accident.
My
name is Amy Janzwood. I'm an assistant professor in political science and at the Baylor School of Environment at McGill University in Montreal.
So when Trump says,
we support Canada, $200 billion a year in subsidies one way or the other.
It's worth asking, what the are you even talking about? What the cursed business clown seems to be talking about is the trade deficit. But if you take away energy, the US actually has a trade surplus with Canada. That's because the US buys 4 million barrels of our oil per year. Oh, sorry, no. Actually, that's per month. No, sorry, it's 4 million barrels of oil a day. Jesus Christ. To put that into perspective, that's about 21,978 Funsicle Crystal View Oasis above ground pools filled to the brim with black goo every 24 hours. Fun. That cool 4 million barrels of oil a day represents about half of US oil imports flowing to refineries specifically designed to handle Canada's heavy crude. That's right, we don't have refineries to handle our own oil. Those are in places like Minnesota, owned by companies like Koch Industries of the infamous Koch brothers, who originally helped Trump get elected. So in a roundabout way, Canada bankrolled our own threat to national security. And because the US is basically our only buyer, there's less competition for price, meaning we've effectively sold our oil to the US for decades at a discount, costing Canadians billions.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the US largely sees us as a polite little resource colony, and most of the time that's how we act. My name is Kai. I work at Dogwood. Dogwood has been around for 20 plus years. We work on democratic reform, indigenous rights, and climate issues. US companies have always been deeply invested in developing Canada's resource industries. And so the oil and gas industry is no different. And the logic that's being used now in the face of the trade war is that, we need to find new dance partners, we need to find new export markets, and we need to rely less on the U.S. as a customer. The U.S. is not just a customer, the U.S. is also an owner, and the U.S. is an investor in a lot of the industries that we're talking about, which really raises the question of how independent we would be from the U.S., from its richest citizens, and from its administration. And those things are all deeply intertwined.
While Canada's oil and gas industry employs about 150,000 people and contributes about 5% to our GDP per year, we're only getting a small fraction of the value. That's because 70% of our oil sands production is owned by foreign companies and shareholders, making our oil and gas industry about as Canadian as Elon Musk when he was married to Grimes, but before he became the Pillsbury Doge boy we all know and love today. Take Imperial Oil, 69% owned by American multinational and climate denial pioneer ExxonMobil.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true.
So Canada building pipelines could help the US profit from selling to China or Europe instead of selling to itself, I guess. And these US companies get real Canadian super subsidies. We spent nearly $30 billion last year subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. That's 30 billion taxpayer dollar reduced supporting oil production that is 70% foreign owned, all while 97% of that oil goes to the United States at a discount. So who exactly is subsidizing who, Donnie? But still, Canadians do benefit from oil and gas exports. So, the argument goes, we need to build more oil pipelines to lessen our dependence on the US. And the first project people point to is one that was abandoned years ago. Back in 2013, the pipeline company TC Energy, then called TransCanada, proposed a 4,500-kilometer oil pipeline from Alberta all the way to New Brunswick to export oil.
One of the reasons why Energy East was seen as, at some point was seen as, a potentially viable option was that it could use some existing natural gas or fossil gas pipeline infrastructure.
That's right. A few modifications to the TransCanada mainline, and you'd only have to build 1,600 kilometers of new pipelines to unleash a 1.1 million barrel daily tsunami of Western Select oil from Alberta to eastern refineries and tankers. Not only would this sell more oil overseas, it would raise the price producers could charge by increasing the possible buyers. Still, 1,600 kilometers of new pipeline was a tall order, and TC Energy knew that. That's because Energy East was actually Plan B in case the Keystone XL pipeline, an expansion of the Keystone pipeline that runs into the United States, didn't pan out. Which it didn't, despite Trudeau batting his eyes and saying, "Pretty please approve this pipeline." President Obama canceled it. But then Trump canceled that cancellation. But then Biden canceled the cancellation of that cancellation. But now Trump canceled the cancellation of that cancel. It's just a mess.
There is another saga behind Energy East in terms of its struggles in the regulatory process, notably a conflict of interest, and the National Energy Board, as it was called at the time, the NEB, was forced to restart the regulatory process, which was a huge setback for Energy East.
Hot pipeline goss. Turns out the chair and the vice chair of the Regulatory Approval Board met privately with a paid TC Energy consultant to discuss overcoming public opposition in Quebec, which was a bad look, especially since the consultant was former Quebec Premier Jean Charest. The only pipeline in this country we'll never cancel is the politician to paid corporate shill pipeline. By now, it was 2017. Trump was back in the White House, and restarting Energy East just seemed like a hassle.
At the point in which TC Energy walked away from the project, it was looking like Keystone XL was back on. It seems like ultimately TC Energy decided it wasn't worth it.
So what's stopping Energy East from happening now? Well, TC Energy is out of the oil business, going all in on gas. And that giant existing pipeline they were going to convert to carry oil now has long-term gas contracts. That means the new Energy East would be 4,500 kilometers of brand new pipeline across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. 10 years ago, the base model cost of Energy East was estimated at $15.7 billion before adding in optional features like protests and delays. But building it now, from scratch, in this economy? Well, we crunched the numbers and the answer is a ton more. Seriously though, there's no proposal. So any number you see in the media is just pulled out of someone's ass. But given the expense, would Energy East 2, bitumen boogaloo even turn a profit?
It doesn't make sense to be building new mega oil sands infrastructure right now. We have not seen proponents come forward to say that we have a project that is, economically viable. So it's, really difficult to imagine a world in which the economics of Energy East would make any sense today. Not to mention the decline of oil demand.
Ah yes, peak oil. Ever since we started pumping organic rock sauce out of the ground, people have wanted more every year. But now, the International Energy Agency has noticed slowing demand for oil. They expect demand to peak in the next 5 years, thanks to electrification of transport, increasingly cheap renewables, and energy-hungry giants like China restructuring their economies to be less reliant on fossil fuels. Peak oil might even be this year, according to BP, which is great news for these pelicans in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, America. That said, peak oil has been predicted several times in the past. But when peak oil does come, oil prices will plummet due to oversupply, and expensive to produce Canadian oil will become less viable. That will be especially true if the United States continues to
Drill, baby, drill.
So, could we build 4,500 kilometers of new pipeline in less than 5 years to beat peak oil? Probably not. A mega east-west pipeline could become a stranded asset where we'd be better off burning billions of dollars in cash for heat. But what if we could move faster? What if we got rid of all these regulations holding pipelines back? Back in March, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith sent a list of demands to Mark Carney that he must address within the first 6 months of his term to avoid an unprecedented national unity crisis, presumably because she forgot to kidnap his child. Ah yes, Alberta separatism is back, baby, and this time it's being promoted on X.com and Fox News. Now this topic deserves a whole video on its own because Western alienation has a long history, so hit all the right buttons and let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see. Smith's demands read like part ransom note and part whatever is the opposite of a BuzzFeed sustainable life hack listicle. We got bangers like ending the prohibition on single-use plastics, lifting the tanker ban off the North BC coast, and repealing Bill C-69, aka the No New Pipelines Act. While critics call it Bill C-69, not to be confused with my swinging uncle's OnlyFans username, CBill69, it's actually not a bill anymore. It's a law called the Impact Assessment Act, which requires resource projects to be assessed for environmental, health, social, and economic impacts, and to ensure they respect Indigenous rights. So, if you hate all of those things, sure, I guess we could just repeal it, but that also opens the door to constitutional legal challenges. Okay, but what if you're not into the whole constitutionally protected rights thing? Well, the CEOs of Canada's oil and gas industry have you covered. During the election, they published this open letter, casually suggesting the new government declare a Canadian energy crisis and use all its available emergency powers to ensure the dramatic regulatory restructuring required to expand the oil and gas sector. Now, where have I heard that idea before?
That is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
But do we really need to suspend the Constitution and set fire to Indigenous treaties just to build pipelines? How much is the Impact Assessment Act really slowing things down?
In fact, we actually don't know what the new impact assessment legislation will mean for pipelines, as we haven't had a chance to test this. And in fact, it responds to a lot of weaknesses in the existing impact assessment regime that have led to legal challenges that have overturned project approvals, like in the case of the Trans Mountain expansion. In fact, I think you could probably argue that having more clarity around impact assessment actually helps proponents, but that's certainly not the kind of messaging that we've seen around this.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Carney has insisted that approvals for new resource projects could be made more streamlined under the existing law.
The time needed to approve a project will be reduced from 5 years to 2.
All I do is win, 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 no matter what. Got money on.
But that remains to be seen. The only thing we know for sure is that quiet on set? The only thing we know for sure is that no new pipelines have been proposed since 2014. The year before, guess who?
No, as much as some politicians would love to blame Trudeau, I think you can actually make an argument that materially the Trudeau government actually did the most in terms of supporting new oil sands pipelines, in the fact that for the very reason that they bought the Trans Mountain Expansion project. And for example, the previous Conservative government who had promised Canada as this energy superpower and promised new oil pipelines, but wasn't able to build any. This is something that politicians, perhaps conveniently forget.
So if the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was such a resounding success, what lessons does it have for us about building pipelines now? The Trans Mountain Expansion, also known by its hardcore rap stage name, TMX, was proposed in 2013 to embiggen the Trans Mountain Pipeline originally built in the 1950s. It's called twinning, where you essentially just stack another pipeline on top of a pipeline to increase its capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day. The 1,100 kilometer pipeline runs from Alberta over the mountains to Burnaby, BC, where it can be loaded into ocean tankers. This is Canada's only major pipeline to the coast. If you want to sell oil to not the US, this is the kind of pipeline you want. The project was put forward by Texas pipeline giant Kinder Morgan, but that opened up a Kinder surprise of BC protesters. NDP Premier John Horgan won an election in part on a promise to fight the pipeline. Of course, this was before he left politics to go work for a coal company. Then in 2018, the 600-person Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, who, along with other complainants, successfully sued for failure to properly consult with First Nations. Why are there so many of these desiccated fish here? Kinder Morgan was in dire straits, so the Trudeau government bought TMX for about $5 billion.
Investors were very lucky in that outcome. They were unanimously in support of that sale, or overwhelmingly in support of that sale. There's lots of reasons to suggest that the project could not have moved ahead otherwise had the federal government not stepped in and purchased it. It was no longer commercially viable for the proponent. It doesn't seem to be a problem for the federal government to continue to provide billions in loans and subsidies as a result.
In other words, Trudeau could have let this project die, but he kept the patient alive with a money transfusion. We nationalized it. Now it's owned by a crown corporation. Then in 2019, Trudeau announced that Canada's shiny new TMX pipeline had been approved. Coincidentally, this was the day after Canada declared a climate emergency. Because words no longer have meaning. Construction started, but suddenly that $5 billion price tag crept higher and higher. Why? Well, multiple factors. Permitting issues, the pandemic, engineering difficulties, route changes, and of course, major floods. Somehow, no one stopped to think that maybe a climate disaster on an oil pipeline might be some kind of sign. But don't worry, they spent $50 million removing rare moss by hand and relocating 100 anthills, 150,000 frogs, and various fish, snails, and snakes. Guys, it's an environmentally friendly pipeline. Imagine being the frog guy and having to count 150,000 frogs you moved. All told, the TMX price tag ballooned to $34 billion, meaning you, me, and every other Canadian personally paid $850 for this pipeline. When Trudeau announced the approval of this project, he mentioned how all of the proceeds would go towards the green transition. But at $34 billion, will there be any proceeds? According to the parliamentary budget officer, no. They estimate the value of the pipeline over 20 years to be between $29 and $33 billion. Put another way, if they found a buyer for the pipeline today, they'd sell at a loss. So the TMX is a big, overpriced hunk of metal with no resale value that we're told is good for the environment, even though it's clearly not. Congratulations, Canada. We built the Cybertruck of infrastructure. The pipeline went online last year, and guess what? China is now its top customer. Mission accomplished! We successfully lowered our dependence on US oil buyers, even though currently the pipeline is not running at full capacity, due in part to high tolls needed to pay back the massive construction costs.
The glaring warning is the reason why governments shouldn't be in the business of buying and owning pipelines. It completely changes the commercial dynamics, as you've already suggested, right?
So what happens if the pipeline isn't owned by the government? What happens if we just force through a pipeline owned by the ruthlessly efficient private sector? So far, we've been talking about oil, but the future of fossil fuels is really in gas. That's because, according to gas industry marketing, it's a bridge fuel to a green transition. The argument is simple. Coal bad, gas less bad. And yes, burning coal is the worst. It's not only terrible for global warming, the toxic particulates make it like smoking cigarettes, without the benefit of looking like James Dean while you line your lungs with carcinogens. Here's a horrifying fact. Fossil fuel pollution kills an estimated 8 million people a year, mostly because of
Beautiful, clean coal.
Compared to coal, gas burns cleaner and efficient-er. So, the argument goes, why not send this glorious gas to poor countries in Asia, still hooked on crappy coal? In theory, global emissions are lower because coal emissions are displaced. But before we get into the giant asterisks above that claim, we first need to talk about how they get that gas overseas. I'm talking about LNG, or liquefied natural gas. The Coastal GasLink pipeline was built to send fracked gas from eastern BC over the mountains to the coast, where it can be liquefied at a cool -162 degrees Celsius. Then it's put on these adorably bulbous boats.
Right, so all of these gas pipelines are essentially an arbitrage opportunity for people who manage a lot of money. If bananas cost 20 cents in one jurisdiction, but people are willing to buy them for $5 in another jurisdiction, then the person who can build the banana cart to get the bananas from the cheap location to the expensive market is going to make a ton of money. And so natural gas is the same idea. Exporting that overseas allows the shippers and the brokers to capture the value difference between what that gas is worth in North America, where it's overabundant and there isn't enough market. Obviously, the price is very low. And then you go to other places around the Pacific where prices are higher because they don't have their own natural gas reserve.
This highlights something you won't find in any pro-gas marketing materials. LNG exports make you compete with customers in Asia. That means LNG pipelines like the Coastal GasLink raise your gas bill. And the more pipelines and export terminals you build, the more you pay. Just ask anyone in Australia. Over the past 10 years, gas prices have tripled thanks to LNG exports, making life more expensive for working families and hurting manufacturing businesses. So LNG exports are good for the economy, and provincial governments get a small cut of the action in royalties, but really, they're a shitty deal for actual people who live and work in Canada. So in a way, LNG pipelines are a little like a permanent carbon tax where all of the money goes to corporate shareholders and the rebate you get looks like this. Pipelines, the unaxable carbon tax. But unlike a carbon tax, which we did a whole video on, does LNG make sense as a climate solution? After all, it's supposed to displace coal in other countries, right?
What these gas companies are looking for is developing countries with unstable electrical grids where we can convince them to sign long-term contracts to buy gas from North America to fuel their power stations. And so we're at this tipping point where a lot of developing countries are looking at the cost of wind and solar, and they're saying, well, why wouldn't we just buy the technology that allows us to generate electricity at home? Why would we buy fuel from the Americans when it's cheaper to just buy the technology to allow us to generate our own electricity?
So LNG is a scam. They want you to think it's replacing coal, but instead it's actually replacing renewables that would otherwise replace coal. It's not lowering emissions, it's locking them in. And this is made worse when you realize that liquefied natural gas has a higher carbon footprint than coal thanks to the energy it takes to cool it and methane leaks along the supply chain. That's because methane traps 84% more heat than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. As renewables get cheaper, US gas companies are scrambling to lock in long-term LNG contracts overseas. So, How do you apply pressure to get these countries to sign? Tariffs.
Europe doesn't want our gas anymore. Advanced economies in Asia like Japan and Korea don't want our gas anymore. And so they're really focused on those smaller countries that are trying to get more electricity to power factories and economic growth. And that is countries like Bangladesh, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, backbreaking tariffs in order to force them to buy more American products. And the product that all of these American billionaires who are funding the Trump administration, what they have to offer is gas.
Billionaires like Steve Schwarzman, worth an estimated $44 billion as the CEO of Blackstone, a $1 trillion private equity firm. Steve here is not only a mega Trump donor who served in his first administration, his company has a huge stake in Western LNG, the Texas-based company proposing to build the new Slisms LNG terminal and PRGT pipeline. Also, he can sell gas overseas while increasing your gas bill at home. But other than that, I hear he's a great guy.
You have these American companies backed by the American government that is now going in and saying, that, no wind and solar, you're going to buy our gas, you're going to burn it, you're going to thank us for it, and you're going to pay us for many, many years to come. That's the business model. It is, shall we say, a little bit coercive.
So LNG is not a bridge to a greener future. It's a roadblock designed to slow the adoption of cheaper, cleaner options. It keeps poor countries poor and under the control of US fossil fuel dependence. And Canada is caught all up in this game. It may be Canada Gas TM, but the US has their hands all over it. Remember TC Energy?
So they used to be called Trans-Canada Pipelines, and it started as a Crown Corporation, the Trans-Canada Pipeline. It was privatized, and TC Energy has really morphed into this kind of continent-wide intelligence/political shop, which happens to build and own pipelines. And so when you look at who is staffing TC Energy these days, it is a rogues gallery of Trump appointees and former US intelligence agents, basically. These are not people that have any expertise in the oil and gas industry particularly. They have expertise in shall we say, exercising U.S. foreign policy at home and abroad. Mike Waltz, the guy who started the Signal group chat and included a journalist, his wife is a vice president at TC Energy. So they have a direct line to the president through his cabinet. And when you look at who is running their intelligence division, it is like the former head of diplomatic security for the entire State Department. It is people who are used to protecting U.S. spies, diplomats, soldiers, and members of the executive in war zones. This is Condoleezza Rice's former head of security during the Iraq War, who now works for TC Energy, trying to build pipelines through Canada.
And nowhere is the handshake between the Canadian government and U.S. business interests more apparent than in the story of how the Coastal GasLink pipeline was built. Okay, this is a huge ask, but think back before the pandemic. Protests against the Coastal GasLink pipeline were leading to delays and cost overruns for TC Energy as one First Nation along the proposed route didn't want a gas pipeline through their land.
So the Wet'suwet'en have 5 clans, and they're one of the nations that has held on to a traditional governance system that predates colonization. The Wet'suwet'en clans discussed the Coastal GasLink pipeline at length and decided not to sign on. And so that decision should be final under, the governance system that's been recognized by the Canadian courts and by the Canadian government. However, the gas companies were going to take no for an answer.
TC Energy kept the project alive by finding a money daddy in the form of private equity.
KKR saw an opportunity when Coastal GasLink was facing all of these protests and it was really, stalled and the project budget was starting to balloon out of control. KKR bought that and de-risked the project.
Fundamentally, we're looking for a critical business or asset that people, companies, societies need to use regardless of what's happening in the rest of the world.
The person who I think is really worth mentioning in that story is David Petraeus, the former U.S. general and U.S. CIA director, who is now the head of KKR's internal intelligence division and oversees all of their sensitive geopolitical investments and advises the company internally on how to deal with things like a restive native population.
That's right, a private equity firm for rich people to get even richer hired David Petraeus to de-risk their investments, like a gas pipeline in Canada. Why?
He brings all of this expertise from the War on Terror. He was the author of the United States Counterinsurgency Manual, and what we saw in Wet'suwet'en territory was really a classic counterinsurgency strategy like the US used in Afghanistan and Iraq, but adapted to rural Canada. David Petraeus has a famous catchphrase from the war in Iraq where he says, "Money is ammunition." And what he means is that you can achieve military objectives without firing a single shot if you have enough American money in a suitcase, right? And that is what we saw through the band council system in the lead up to Coastal GasLink construction, is secret deals, lots of money on the table, and people who were forced to sign agreements that contained these ridiculous, undemocratic clauses like, you know, if any of your band members criticize the natural gas industry on Facebook, you got to crack down on them.
But while the unlimited money glitch strategy may work in the military, it has its limits when it comes to de-risking investments. Long story short, the Wet'suwet'en Band Council signed on to the project, but that council is set up under the Indian Act. But the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, the people Canadian law recognizes as the legal representatives, did not sign on to the project. However,
they did provide an alternate route to go around the most sensitive parts of the territory, but TC Energy felt like that would cost too much money, and so they said, too bad, we're calling in the cops.
TC Energy obtained a court injunction, and the Canadian government sent in the RCMP to continue their proud tradition of criminalizing inconvenient Indigenous people and extracting billions of dollars of wealth from their land.
Get your f***ing gun off me! This is sovereign Wet'suwet'en land!
So, what's the lesson here? Pipelines take years to build. You're looking at 5 to 10 years, so 15 to 20 years ago, maybe more pipelines made economic sense. But if the plan is to distance ourselves from the US by building more pipelines now, here are some things you need to keep in mind. Pipelines built by private investors could enrich US billionaires connected to the Trump administration, making our problems worse. If the government builds pipelines, we risk spending public money creating a stranded asset that will never see a return, especially since oil demand is slowing. All pipelines funnel profit to the United States because US companies are heavily invested in Canadian oil and gas. Any pipeline built in Canada will be built on Indigenous land, and every major pipeline built in the last decade has faced resistance. That could lead to painful, protracted conflicts, human rights violations, and most importantly, for people who lack a soul, massive cost overruns. Speaking of money, LNG pipelines will make your gas bill exponentially higher. So if you're one of those Trudeau people because of the carbon tax, good news. LNG is the new thing to hate. Of course, not building pipelines comes with risks too, like pissing off Alberta and making them want to leave. And look, maybe you're just one of those people who thinks it's a good idea to spend billions of dollars just to have the option to tell the US to go f itself. I get it. But pipelines can leak and explode. Tankers can sink and spill, and those costs are paid by local communities who receive little to no benefit from these projects. To say nothing of the climate risks, my God! Any new pipeline will increase carbon emissions. Remember the Energy East pipeline from Alberta to New Brunswick? Well, back then, it was estimated that it would add 32 million tons of carbon emissions each year, basically like adding 7 million non-Cybertruck cars onto the road. And that's just the pollution to get the oil out of the ground and to the refineries. That's not counting the emissions from actually burning the fuel after it's refined. Personally, even if a pipeline makes money, it's kind of a dick move to shaft young people with a less habitable planet. So what if instead of asking, more pipelines though? We asked, What would it take to lower our dependence on fossil fuels as fast and as fairly as possible? That could look like investments in high-speed rail, public transit, bike infrastructure, EV chargers, grid improvements from east to west, renewable energy and storage, heat pumps and insulation at home, and building affordable housing with energy-efficient designs, just to name a few. Plus, as a fun side benefit, we'd be lowering our dependence on the US.
So I think, the main lesson that we should be taking from this moment is that we need to be diversifying, right, economically. We can think about this in an energy sector, but it's not just about diversifying from the US to China, right? It's thinking about how do we build a more resilient economy, and that comes with a conversation about how do we diversify, right, away from oil and gas, and thinking about what do alternatives look like in terms of economic diversification. I would love to stop talking about pipelines because I think that there's a lot of really great policy ideas that are on the table, things that have a lot of benefit for Canadians, for energy security and reliability, thinking about east-west transmission infrastructure, interties, better coordination between provinces for our electricity. We have seen dramatic changes in cost competitiveness around renewables. And so, we are already seeing those market signals in place. We're already seeing, things like the uptake of heat pumps, and there's some great programs that support that. These are ways to have, more reliable, affordable, accessible, and more sustainable, in the broadest sense of the term, ways to be thinking about energy as opposed to pipe dreams.
The crossroads that the world is at right now in terms of energy is, it's really a question of fuel versus technology. In a model where all of your energy comes from burning things, then the supplies of that fuel become really important. And you've seen the US go to war around the world to control supply chains for fossil fuels. What we have now is a totally disruptive new technology, a bunch of new technologies. If people around the world can buy technology that allows them to generate their own energy at home from their own resources, then they don't need those supply chains of coal, oil, and gas that are controlled by American billionaires and other oligarchs around the world. They don't need to be in this dependent relationship with the world's largest retailers of fossil fuels like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. I'm talking about Canada trying to skate to where the puck is going and apply some of our expertise in order to help improve those technologies for ourselves and for other countries.
If there is an upside to Trump being elected again, maybe it's that Canadians and the world are reevaluating the status quo. As Leonard Cohen sang in his iconic song Hallelujah, when you've been selling oil at a discount to an unstable nuclear superpower led by an openly fascist administration threatening your borders, you start to wonder maybe being an export-driven, resource-based economy isn't all it's cracked up to be. Now, which one of you wants to have a threesome with me and Joni Mitchell? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to support the Goose financially, you can join the flock over on Patreon. Check out the links in the description to follow Dogwood BC, pre-order Amy Janzwood's new book, Mega Pipelines, Mega Resistance, and watch the documentary YINTAH about the Wet'suwet'en pipeline fight. See you next time. Hi. Yeah.